In this video, I'll show you exactly why you should stop using print statements and why you should be logging instead. When I first started programming, I was using print statements everywhere in my code. They made it easy to debug my command line calculator app that I'd made at that time. Once I got to university, I thought I'd learn best practices and industry standards. Sadly, that wasn't the case. I ended up mostly working on projects on my own or with people who knew about as much as I did, so I never learned what I was actually supposed to do. At my first job, while doing my first ticket, I used system out println to print some code to the console so I could get an idea of what was going on in the flow to see if I could fix this bug. After pushing these changes for a code review, I looked towards my senior dev. She slowly got up, put her boxing gloves on, and started walking towards me. How could I have avoided this situation? I should have used some logging. Logging is essential because it helps in debugging, monitoring, and maintaining your application. This is what logging looks like in production. Logs are usually made up of three components: a timestamp, the log level, and the data that you want to keep track of. The timestamp tells you when the event happened. Now imagine some user reports that his system crashes every day at midnight. You can just check what events are taking place at midnight, and that should give you a starting point for what could be going wrong. The log level helps you control the verbosity of the logs. In other words, it helps you categorize what you're printing out. The different levels of logs are debug, info, warn, error, fatal. There might be some variations to this, but what tends to happen is that an engineer will get assigned to be on call. This means that they have to be available outside of office hours in case the app crashes or has some error preventing a user from doing something really important. The on-call engineer will usually get an alert on their phone every time something fatal happens or an error log is printed out. So if you don't want to make your on-call engineer angry, you have to be really careful about using correct log levels. So how do you log? The code for logging is quite similar in most languages. Now you might be tempted to use it just like your print statements, where you just use a plus to concatenate the strings that you're logging out. That's the wrong way to go about it. Why? Well, the short answer is it affects performance. Pretend you have info level enabled and you have a line of code that logs out a trace line. That trace line will still be evaluated. In other words, even though that log is not being printed out, it's still being concatenated and turned into a single string. Suppose you have a log trace that is used to keep track of a process that is executed 1000 times. That line will have to evaluate and concatenate those values 1000 times. What you can do instead is parameterize your logging like so. The brackets will be replaced with the parameters that you've set up in the order that you've written it. So another thing to keep in mind is that you should include enough context to make debugging easier in the future, including things like the name of the class that's being logged out, and the unique ID of the object that you are monitoring will be a lifesaver for the future you. You should be careful what kind of data you're logging, as it could affect performance. Consider the following example. You have an array of objects with 100 entries. You want to log this out. Now, in general, I would advise you to stay away from doing something like this because, as you can imagine, you will need to iterate through this array 100 times every time this function is called, which could affect the performance of your application, especially if you are currently logging a level above this one. Unfortunately, there are times when you have no choice but to keep track of these items. In that case, what you can do is write a quick if statement that checks if your current log level is enabled, then evaluate these log lines. If you're just starting out as a software engineer and you find yourself in a position where you wish there was a YouTube tutorial for something very specific and you can't find it, drop me a comment below and I'll make a video about it. Or maybe I'll make a video about the resources that you can use to learn more about these things. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more of these kinds of tutorials.